Welcome back to Flashpoint on UNC Charlotte. Today we are celebrating Juneteenth. Did you know there's a specific flag for Juneteenth? In fact, it has a backstory that goes back to the late 1990s.
The Juneteenth flag commemorates the day that slavery ended here in the U.S. The red, white, and blue banner with a bursting star in the middle is full of symbols, according to the flag's creator, activist Ben Haith, founder of the National Juneteenth Celebration Foundation. Let's start with colors, of course representing the American flag, and a reminder that slaves and their descendants were and are Americans. The curve across the width of the flag represents a new horizon, the opportunities and promise that lay ahead for Black Americans after freedom. The white star in the center of the flag has dual meaning, representing Texas, the Lone Star State first. It was in Galveston in 1865 when Union soldiers informed the country's last remaining slaves that the Civil War was over and they were free. Haith says that star also goes beyond Texas, representing the freedom of African Americans in all 50 states. The bursting outline around that star is inspired by a nova, or a new star. According to astronomy, this represents a new beginning for all African Americans.
Joining us now is Dr. Ahmad Nadiri, an associate professor of English and Arabic Studies at Johnson C. Smith University. Professor, thanks for coming back on. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
You've told me in the past that Juneteenth is symbolic and that it's a teachable moment. If that's the case, what do you think is the lesson of Juneteenth?
I think the lesson is some of the different means by which African Americans, well, really formerly enslaved Africans, struggled to find their place in what became their new nation, or tried to find a place in an already existing nation. And I would say that would be a part of that struggle, and really kind of you might say, one of the first steps of that struggle. Because before that time, of course, there was no recognized place for African Americans or for the formerly enslaved in the country. And of course, they wouldn't formally be recognized as citizens until the 14th Amendment. And so I would say it is a part of a long freedom struggle that starts hundreds of years ago, before that point, but is one of the first times in which there is the potential for a political and a civic position for these people.
And it was, at the time, liberty delayed for those enslaved folks in Texas. And today it's recognition delayed, do you think?
Well, I think I would agree with that. And I think when we look at Texas as one example, but actually the 13th Amendment was only as powerful as the Union troops that were there to enforce it. So what we see is that actually, as the Union soldiers move from place to place, that's actually when the 13th Amendment comes into effect. So although it's decreed some years earlier, it doesn't actually have practical effect until we see in Juneteenth is just the most powerful reminder of that fact.
To that point, Juneteenth, we now know, you hear about it. In the last few years, more companies recognize the day. Last year, it became a federal holiday. You and I spoke about it at the time. What do you credit for the groundswell of support and progress in the last few years?
I think honestly, you'd have to say that the social unrest and beginning really kind of peaking in 2020 was a powerful motivator for it. That there was always some support and growing support, but I think that kind of really put it in a way, it presented it or gave it an opportunity to kind of serve as a way in which to try to heal or smooth over some rough edges. And I think that it's hard to make an argument that it would have been a holiday without a lot of the unrest. And so it's a little different perhaps from the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, which kind of emerged in the mid 80s. And I mean, although there was a lot of political activity on behalf of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, I would say that the events of 2020 especially were probably, although they weren't intended to have that consequence, I would say that they probably did have that consequence.
A few members of Congress voted against Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday last year, I think 14 of them perhaps. And there's an ongoing conversation about curriculum in our schools, and you're a professor, so you know that. How much do you think we should be focusing on our country's past, including the ugly chapter of slavery and the story of Juneteenth?
I think we should. I think that if we're going to teach history, that we need to, but I think it needs to be more expansive. I think that one of the problems with the ways in which slavery is presented is that it's presented from the perspective of the enslaving class, so that traditionally you have slaves and you have masters, when in actuality you had people who were enslaved and you had people who enslaved them. And because we rarely talk about Black history or African history except from the point of enslavement or the point of colonization, the entire history then is presented as kind of a crime scene. And then we're just talking about mitigating harm or mitigating the presentation of harm. And I think that in a state like North Carolina, where about 20 to 25% of its residents are African American, and probably slightly more than that are in the public school system, I think you would teach the history the same way that we teach the foundations of the United States from the European side, which is to say that you get a healthy dose of European history, and then we see the progression as people arrive in the Americas. And I think we should do the same thing with African history. That is to present a healthy dose of it so that people have some real context for the peoples who were enslaved and brought to the United States, amongst many other places in the Caribbean and South and Central America. And we would have a better understanding of the true history of all the peoples who were brought to the United States or who were already in the United States. And then it wouldn't just be necessarily it would be a greater conversation. And I think there would be greater respect all around. And I think that it would especially help African American students who then wouldn't just be trying to situate themselves in the context of slavery and freedom.
Yeah, and perhaps we all get more out of a conversation like what you're suggesting. Do you think do you think Juneteenth is different for folks here, say in the Carolinas, versus what it would be in other states?
I think it is, and I would assume that Texas would be obviously the place that where it would have the greatest impact. Although traditionally many different states and many different regions had specific celebrations related to their experience of emancipation. And so what we'll probably see is that as it becomes more of a federal holiday, that it just is presented in the same way. And that unfortunately much of the local flavor may be missed. But I would assume that in Texas it probably has the greatest significance, although there may be a political bent to it in the way that it's celebrated and observed and or remarked upon.
Okay. All right, Dr. Aman Nadiri, Associate Professor at Johnson C. Smith University. Professor, thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
More Flashpoint after this.